In a grand Spanish court bound by pride and tradition, an Arab prince stands isolated, misunderstood by all, until a humble maid approaches and speaks softly in his own language, offering him a single cup of tea. In this simple act of kindness, two hearts from different worlds connect deeply, defying rules, protocol, and expectations. But love in such rigid circles carries risks and demands sacrifice, forcing them to decide between duty and the quiet truth they found in each other's eyes. Ultimately, their courage to choose authenticity over acceptance reshapes the meaning of honor, freedom, and love itself. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. The great audience chamber of the Palacio del Almirantazgo was cloaked in the stale perfume of formality. Beneath the gilded molding of the high, vaulted ceiling, dozens of nobles stood fanning themselves, their silks rustling like agitated wings, the lace at their sleeves quivering each time a whispered speculation passed from one powdered mouth to another. Light from the arched windows poured onto the polished marble floor, made hazy by the creeping Andalusian heat, which pressed like unseen hands into every crevice of the ornate hall. Somewhere near the altar, a harpsichord played a soft, polite tune, one that failed to mask the tension rising among the assembled guests. Cadiz, as always, performed its politics in full regalia. Spanish flags hung motionless against the walls, the red and gold seeming brighter against the marble columns that framed the dais. Gold-trimmed uniforms gleamed under the chandelier's light. Fans fluttered and closed with tiny snaps, delicate sounds that cut the air like thread snipped from a loom. Ladies with coal dark lashes and powdered shoulders leaned toward their husbands or patrons, murmuring observations behind their scented gloves. Their expressions were equal parts boredom and intrigue. A hush fell, not sudden but growing, one voice quieting another, until only the distant music and the creak of leather boots remained. And then the doors opened. They did not enter as a procession. There was no ceremonial announcement. Instead, the Arabian delegation moved with quiet precision, a line of 6 men in dignified dress, their footsteps muffled against the stone. At the center was a man who did not look to the crowd nor pause at the grandeur around him. He walked as though he had already seen greater halls, already heard more dangerous silences. Prince Amir al-Malik ibn Rashid wore robes of ivory silk, trimmed in gold thread. The fabric caught the light as he passed, his dishdasha pristine, flowing beneath a bisht that draped over his shoulders like moonlight caught in motion. Around his head, a carefully wrapped turban of saffron and white was secured with a single golden pin. He moved like a man trained to diplomacy by the steady erosion of trust, silent, observing, controlled. He took his place on the seat prepared for him at the foot of the dais, slightly lower than the elevated chairs of the Spanish officials. He neither protested nor adjusted his posture. He sat with his back straight, his hands resting in perfect stillness on his knees, and his eyes fixed ahead with a composure that made some uncomfortable. It was not arrogance. It was absence. He had been here before, though not in Cadiz, always a guest, never at home. A flurry of movement followed as the Spanish court returned to its choreography. The king's envoy, an aging nobleman with bristling sideburns and a red sash, stood to deliver the greeting. He spoke in formal Castilian, loud and deliberate. Each sentence was relayed by a translator who stood beside him, an interpreter unfamiliar with Amir's dialect, and less familiar still with the subtleties of protocol. Words like honor, alliance, and hospitality stumbled from the translator's mouth with an awkward rhythm, softened by vague gestures. Prince Amir did not reply. He did not frown. He simply listened, his gaze steady and unreadable. When the envoy spoke of Spain's generosity, of mutual benefits, of trade and agreements that would ensure both nations' prosperity, the translator struggled. His voice faltered on words that had no equivalent in Amir's native tongue. And still, the prince remained silent. Murmurs stirred at the edges of the chamber. A nobleman coughed pointedly. A lady in pale blue whispered something behind her fan, earning a flutter of amusement from the woman beside her. To them, his silence was an insult, or worse, indifference. Their world revolved on ceremony and cleverness. Silence, they believed, held no place in diplomacy. Behind a marble pillar near the chamber's edge, half obscured by shadow, a young woman stood with a silver tray balanced in both hands. Isabel de Montijo, her white apron crisp and freshly pressed, waited for the signal to step forward. She had been told to remain invisible, as always. Maids did not speak during formal proceedings. They did not pause. They did not notice. And yet, as her gaze settled on the man seated before the court, something inside her paused and noticed. She had seen pride before. She had seen men wear silence like armor. But this was not that. The prince's face was composed, but not stiff. His expression bore the kind of stillness that comes not from disinterest, but from exhaustion, the sort acquired over years of bearing civility as a shield. His gaze had drifted slightly downward toward the mosaicked floor. His shoulders held tension not of offense, but of endurance. Isabel recognized it. Her mother had worn the same expression in the weeks after her return from Tangier, when grief had sharpened her every silence into something deeper. She shifted her weight, adjusting the tray in her hands. A gentle clink of porcelain chimed as the cups settled. The tea she carried was not a usual offering. Mint leaves, honey, a touch of rosewater. The kitchen steward had ordered it at the last minute, unsure if the gesture would be noticed or even welcomed. A diplomatic token, little more than flavored water in a silver pot. But Isabel knew differently. Her mother had taught her how to make it. And more than that, she had taught her what it meant. She looked again at the prince, her breath catching. He had not moved since the envoy began his monologue, though now his fingers tapped once, slowly, against his knee. The first visible gesture. Not frustration, not impatience. Just a quiet shift. She stepped forward. The sound of her footsteps echoed, delicate but distinct. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, drawn first by the movement, then the defiance of protocol. She passed between the columns, through a pool of light cast by the tall windows. Her head was bowed, her pace measured, but the tray in her hands remained steady. By the time she reached the dais, the translator had stopped speaking. The envoy had paused, uncertain whether to continue. Isabel did not glance at him. Her eyes were on the prince. She stopped beside him, the silver tray held out with both hands. Slowly, with practiced grace, she lowered it toward him. The porcelain cup sat at its center, steam curling faintly in the heavy air, and then softly, her voice broke the silence. "May this bring peace to your heart," she said. In Arabic, her accent clear, her tone low and respectful. A gasp escaped someone behind her. A fan dropped. In the space of a breath, the entire chamber seemed to halt. Prince Amir's head turned. His gaze rose, unhurried and focused, until his eyes met hers. The silence in the chamber was no longer one of politeness, but of rupture. A single sentence, gently spoken, had torn through centuries of tradition like a thin veil. Isabel's voice still seemed to echo in the grand vaults of the ceiling, and though the sound had long since faded, its effect remained suspended in the thick, perfumed air. No one moved. From the front rows to the distant shadows of the hall, every gaze fixed on the same point, on the maid standing before a prince, offering him a cup not as a servant, but as an equal. No protocol had prepared them for this. No rule had been written for kindness spoken in an unfamiliar tongue. The nobles' faces shifted in a tide of confusion, amusement, offense. A few ladies covered their mouths, uncertain whether they were supposed to laugh or gasp. A rustle of silk and feathers passed like wind through wheat, but the prince did not blink. He looked at Isabel for a long moment, his expression still unreadable, serene, yet somehow transformed. Then, With the gravity of a man honoring something far older than court etiquette, he stood. It was not abrupt. He rose as if moved by a quiet force, the flowing folds of his robe falling into place as though shaped by water. The gesture was simple, deliberate, and devastating in its meaning. He bowed his head slightly, not to the nobles watching, but to Isabel. He extended his hand. She had not expected it, and for a second, her breath caught in her throat. The porcelain teacup trembled slightly on the tray, but her training carried her forward, and she lifted it toward him with both hands, careful and poised. As his fingers closed around the cup, they brushed hers, not by design, not carelessly. The contact was brief, no more than a passing warmth, but it struck her like a cord plucked deep within her chest. Her hand remained steady, but her heartbeat did not. The prince brought the cup to his lips and paused, as if acknowledging the moment in silence before taking a sip. Then he spoke. A single phrase in Arabic. His voice was low, musical, but firm. Isabel heard it clearly, and for a breathless instant, she forgot how to stand. He had said, "You see me." The words landed not just in her ears, but somewhere deeper, somewhere raw. It wasn't a phrase used in diplomacy or courtesies. It was something a man said in private. Something sacred. She didn't reply. She couldn't. The realization swept over her like a sudden tide, leaving her adrift in the shallows of her own thoughts. What had she done? What had she touched in him? The translator, standing to one side, opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked helplessly toward the Spanish officials, unable to render a translation he didn't understand. The weight of the moment passed over him entirely. At the front of the room, Count Sebastián de los Ríos stood with measured stillness, though the knuckles gripping his ceremonial staff had whitened. His lips pressed into a faint line. He had seen power shift before, sometimes in battle, sometimes in council chambers, but never like this. Not in a glance. Not in the space between a prince and a maid. His gaze moved to his niece, standing elegantly beside him in a gown of palest gray. Eleanor's fan was closed, unmoving in her gloved hand. Her eyes remained on the prince, unreadable but unwavering. It was the first time all morning she had not glanced at herself in a mirror. A few rows back, the whispers began to coil through the chamber like smoke, rising in cautious threads. The audience, so carefully orchestrated, had lost its shape. Even the court musician at the harpsichord faltered, letting the final note die unfinished. The king's envoy cleared his throat loudly. He gestured toward the translator, then looked imploringly at the delegation. It was an attempt to return to form, to retrieve something of the ceremony that had just unraveled. But Prince Emir did not sit. Instead, he turned again to Isabel. This time, his voice was gentler, quieter, not meant for the room. Another phrase in Arabic, spoken with the faintest touch of something unguarded. Isabel understood the words, but not yet their meaning. Not truly. Her breath trembled. She lowered her eyes. Then, with the practiced grace of someone trained to vanish, she turned and stepped backward. She did not run. She did not falter. The tray remained steady in her hands as she walked toward the servants' alcove, every inch of her spine straight, every step a performance of composure. But her heart was no longer composed. It beat wildly beneath her bodice, the sound thudding in her ears. Behind her eyes, a brightness built, one that she refused to let fall. The curtain into the alcove parted and closed behind her, shutting out the court and its gazes. But nothing could shut out the sensation flooding through her, like warmth after years of cold. It was not infatuation. It was not even boldness. It was recognition. She pressed the tray to her chest and exhaled. Behind her, in the chamber she'd just left, the voices rose again. They had grown braver now, emboldened by distance. Some questioned her accent, others her presence. A nobleman called it absurd. Another muttered that the prince must be mocking them. But Prince Emir did not join in their conversation. He remained standing a moment longer, watching the place where she had disappeared. Something shifted behind his expression, something no one else noticed, distracted as they were by hierarchy and performance. It was not a smile. It was not sadness. It was the look of a man who had been reached. The envoy stepped forward again, voice strained with forced enthusiasm, returning to the agenda in a tone that attempted to reclaim control. The translator resumed his position, clumsily picking up where he had left off. The prince finally returned to his seat. He said nothing. Behind the curtain, Isabel leaned against the cool stone wall, the tray pressed flat against her skirts. The clamor of the chamber dulled to a muffled hum. Her mind, however, was deafening. She replayed his words, not once, but a dozen times, searching them for meaning, for weight, for danger. Her breath came quickly, her fingers tight on the tray's edge. Then, from a few paces away, she heard a voice, low and clear, directed not to her, but to the chamberlain who had stepped into the alcove moments earlier. Find out everything about the maid who speaks Arabic. The corridors behind the grand chamber twisted like the innards of a labyrinth, narrow and unadorned, lit only by the flickering of oil lamps mounted on aged stone walls. Isabel moved swiftly through them, her skirts brushing the worn floor as her steps echoed down the path she had taken hundreds of times before. But never like this. Her pulse thundered in her ears, an erratic rhythm of dread and wonder that made her breath shallow. The tray, now empty of its porcelain burden, felt impossibly light in her trembling hands. Her fingers still remembered the warmth of his. The briefest touch, uncalculated and quiet, had kindled something in her chest that refused to dim. And yet, even now, reality returned like a cold wind slipping beneath a door. She had spoken to a prince, in his own language, in front of the court. In Cadiz, impropriety was not washed away by good intentions. She knew what she had done. Even as her feet carried her farther from the audience chamber, her mind whispered all the rules she had broken. Servants did not speak unless spoken to. Servants did not step forward during official proceedings. Servants certainly did not make eye contact with royalty, let alone address them in a language foreign to the court. Her gesture had been one of instinct, not strategy. But instinct, she knew too well, offered no protection against the machinery of power. Still, regret would not take root, because something in that moment had been real. The look in the prince's eyes, a flicker of astonishment, followed by something quieter, almost aching, was not something she could forget. Amid the carefully rehearsed phrases of statesmen and the veiled scorn of painted noblewomen, his reaction had been genuine. She slipped into the scullery with a quiet breath, her back pressing against the wall as the tray lowered slowly into the waiting basin. The room was steeped in the scent of rosemary from the bunches hanging to dry above the hearth. Soap residue clung to the copper pots stacked in the corner, and a fire snapped weakly in the grate. In the stillness, she could almost believe the world had narrowed again, returned to the familiar rhythm of service. Almost. But the weight pressing into her chest remained. She removed her apron slowly, her hands moving with mechanical precision. Across the room, another maid glanced at her with wide eyes, then quickly turned away, her silence sharper than any accusation. It was not hostility. It was fear. Isabel understood it too well. She had only just begun to wash the tray when a voice called her name from the doorway. The house steward. He did not explain. He never did. He simply looked at her in that hollow, expectant way that left no room for refusal. She followed him without a word. The hallway to the Count's private study was even colder than she remembered. A corridor of polished floors and tall windows, it faced the central courtyard where the orange trees bloomed in careful manicured silence. The sunlight had dimmed. Shadows stretched longer now across the marble tiles. She kept her gaze low, her hands clasped in front of her, careful not to show her shaking fingers. When the steward opened the door and stepped aside, she entered alone. The study was modest for a man of the Count's station. No excessive decoration, just rows of orderly volumes, a writing desk of dark oak, and a single high-backed chair turned toward the hearth. He stood beside it, gloved hands resting lightly on the edge of the mantel. Count Sebastián de los Ríos did not look at her right away. She remained near the door, her posture straight, her chin lifted only as far as was proper. Her eyes, however, never rose above the height of his cravat. When he finally turned, his expression was mild, courteous. But there was something in his gaze, a glint that never softened, not even when his mouth curved into the faintest echo of a smile. "I understand," he said, "that you've been educated in Arabic." She offered a small nod. "Yes, Your Grace." He crossed to his desk and opened a drawer, retrieving a small parchment. His tone remained even, conversational. "Tell me, where did you learn?" "Not many maids in this household are fluent in a foreign tongue." "My mother taught me, sir," she answered carefully. "She was born in Cadiz, but spent her early years in Tangier. Her family traded in dyes." "And your father?" "He died when I was very young." The Count studied her, fingers laced together, expression unreadable. "So your mother raised you in two tongues?" "Yes, Your Grace." "How fortunate." The words came soft, but their edge was unmistakable. He leaned back slightly, his weight shifting as though considering her from a greater distance. "And yet," he continued, "in this household, you never mentioned it, never offered it as a skill. Why is that?" Isabel met the question with the only answer she could afford. "There was no reason to, sir. It did not seem necessary." The Count's silence stretched between them. Then, without raising his voice, he began again. "This delegation," he said, pacing a slow arc behind his chair, "has come to us under delicate terms. The Sultanate has agreed to this audience on trust. Trust that we will present ourselves with civility and decorum. Trust that we understand what is at stake." He stopped and looked at her. "Do you?" She kept her voice level. "I believe so, Your Grace." He inclined his head slightly. "Good. Then you'll understand why I say this to you not in anger, but with concern." He stepped closer, his gaze no longer polite, but piercing. "Your actions today were noticed, not just by me, not just by the court, by him." Her breath caught. "You may think your gesture was harmless," he said, "but it was not. It was inappropriate. It was disruptive." She said nothing. He circled her slowly. "You've brought attention to yourself, attention you will not enjoy. I advise you, Miss de Montijo, to remain silent, to remain invisible, to remember your place, before someone else reminds you more harshly." She felt the cold press of fear at her spine. Then, his voice softened again, as if nothing had passed between them. "You're dismissed." She left with her hands cold, and her spine aching from the effort of holding herself still. The scullery was nearly empty when she returned. The fire had died low, casting a faint orange glow against the copper pans and darkened brick. She found a bucket of water waiting near the hearth, still warm, and knelt beside it. The copper pot before her was already scoured clean, but she scrubbed it anyway, her hands red and raw with effort. The light changed. She glanced up. An older man had entered, quiet as dusk, his movements slow but sure. His robes were simple compared to the grandeur of court dress, but his bearing carried unmistakable dignity. One of the Arabian delegates. His face was weathered, his eyes kind. He did not speak. He set something on the work table beside her, a folded parchment, sealed with a mark she did not recognize, and then he left, just as silently. She waited until the footsteps faded, then reached for the letter, with hands that trembled despite herself. Her chamber upstairs was narrow, tucked beneath the roof beams, shared with two other maids who were not there now. She closed the door softly and sat on the edge of her cot, lifting the seal with careful fingers. Inside was a short message, written in Arabic. "Your voice reached me when no one else did. A single sprig of dried desert thyme was folded within." She pressed the paper to her chest, breath caught in her throat, eyes stinging for reasons she could not name. The corridor beyond her door creaked. She looked up and saw Doña Elena standing silently in the hall, watching her. Doña Elena stepped into the room without knocking. The candlelight caught the sheen of her silk gown as she entered, each measured step a reminder that she had never once been asked to wait for permission. Her presence was like the tide, inevitable and quiet, but always eroding something as it moved forward. She closed the door gently behind her, and the simple sound carried through the narrow chamber like the soft click of a lock. Isabel didn't rise. She sat still on the edge of her cot, the parchment folded tightly in her lap, its edges pressing against her palm. Her shoulders remained straight, her chin level, but the racing of her pulse was harder to command. The figure before her wasn't loud or angry. She didn't need to be. Elena's eyes swept the room with practiced elegance. Her lips curled into a polite smile, one that never quite reached her eyes. Her gown, a pale lavender silk with pearl beading at the sleeves, shifted as she moved closer, its rustle more fluid than fabric should sound, like water passing over stone. "My uncle believes in order," she said, her voice a soothing murmur. "He considers it a virtue, you know. Predictability, stability. Nothing unsettles him more than when people behave unexpectedly." She glanced around the small chamber, gaze lingering for a heartbeat too long on the discarded apron folded near the wash basin. "And yet," she continued, "even the smallest ripple can upset a still surface, can't it?" Isabel said nothing. Elena turned her eyes on her at last, cool, gray, and unwavering. "You've caught his attention, of course, though I'm sure that wasn't your intention." Still, Isabel did not respond. She held the silence between them like a shield. Elena moved a step closer, graceful even in the confines of the narrow space. Her voice softened further, dipping into the cadence of a confidant. "The prince is rather compelling, isn't he?" she said. "So composed, so enigmatic. I imagine it must be difficult not to be intrigued by someone so different, especially when one's life offers so little variety." The smile remained in place, but the words sliced cleanly. "Such beautiful Arabic, by the way," she added lightly. "I hadn't expected it from you. I suppose we all carry small surprises." Eleanor paused, studying Isabel's face. "You should be careful, though. Courtesies can be misunderstood. Kindness, mistaken for something else entirely." Still no reply. She stepped forward again, too close now. Her perfume, something soft and powdered, curled faintly in the air between them. "Men like him," Elena murmured, "are trained to be gracious, to give attention where it is politically useful." "It's admirable, really, how convincing they can be." Her voice was still velvet soft. "But I would be sorry to see you hurt, truly." At last, Isabel spoke. "What do you want from me?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Only your understanding. I don't wish to see you dismissed. I don't wish for whispers to reach places they shouldn't. You've worked hard, haven't you? It would be a shame for all of that to unravel." Over a moment. The threat, buried beneath grace, landed with precision. "I only came to remind you," Eleanor said, stepping back now, smoothing the fabric of her sleeve, "that in this household, visibility is not always a gift." Her eyes dropped briefly to the floor, then returned to Isabel's with deliberate calm. "Be careful what you let grow," she said gently, in the space between words. She turned toward the door, reaching for the handle. "You seem like a thoughtful girl. I'm sure you'll reflect on what's best." And then she left. The door closed softly again, sealing the silence behind her. Isabel sat motionless, the parchment still in her lap, her other hand clutched tightly around the locket she wore on a ribbon around her neck. The metal was warm from the press of her skin. Inside, hidden beneath the protective curve of its cover, the sprig of time remained, crushed slightly now, but intact. The moment pressed on her from all sides. Elena had not raised her voice, had not issued commands. She hadn't needed to. Her words had dripped like ink into clear water, darkening everything they touched. Even the candlelight seemed dimmer now, more uncertain. And yet, even with her throat tight and her hands cold, Isabel did not retreat. Not entirely. She tucked the letter beneath her pillow, slipped the locket back inside her bodice, and breathed deeply through her nose, forcing stillness into her body. Elena's warnings had not been idle. She was right about one thing. Attention could be dangerous. But something else had shifted in the room earlier, something Isabel couldn't ignore. It had nothing to do with alliances or diplomacy. It was something in the prince's eyes, something she hadn't imagined. That night, the corridors of the guest wing were nearly silent. The hour was late, and most of the household was occupied preparing for the second round of audiences and meals that would resume in the morning. Isabel moved carefully, a stack of folded linens balanced against her hip as she stepped down the quiet hall. The wall sconces flickered with low-burning lamps, their light casting long shadows across the patterned floor. She passed the threshold of the third chamber when she paused. Something had stirred behind her. A sound. Soft. Her name. She turned sharply, the linens nearly slipping from her arms. A figure emerged from the alcove near the window, stepping into the pale gold spill of lamplight. Prince Amir stood alone in the corridor, his robe darker now, a deep gray that blended into the shadows. The turban was gone, and his hair was pulled back at the nape, the loose strands grazing the curve of his neck. His gaze met hers, unguarded. "I need to speak with you," he said quietly. The corridor was quiet, its stillness broken only by the whispering flicker of oil lamps mounted along the stone walls. Their golden glow pulsed gently in the breath of a passing draft, casting long, moving shadows across the mosaic floor. The light danced over Isabel's face, outlining the slope of her cheek and the subtle curve of her lashes, as she stood frozen, linen bundles clasped to her chest. Prince Amir didn't step closer. He didn't have to. His presence filled the air between them with the weight of unspoken questions and a tension that trembled just beneath the surface of decorum. He stood in his dark robe, composed, as if the shadows were part of him. He made a subtle motion with his hand, a tilt of his fingers in silent invitation. Isabel's breath caught. She glanced once down the corridor, searching the corners and the gaps between doors. There was no one else. Not yet. She nodded, a barely perceptible dip of her chin, then shifted the linens into the crook of one arm. The other hand found the edge of her skirt, holding it slightly off the ground as she followed him. They walked in silence through the narrow servants' passage, their steps soundless against the flagstone floor. The walls pressed in around them, not oppressively, but with a kind of secrecy, like the corridors themselves were keeping what passed between them hidden from the wider world. Isabel kept her eyes on the path ahead, every nerve taut with awareness of the man just steps in front of her, the way the hem of his robe brushed the floor, the way his shoulders moved beneath the fine wool. The passage curved and narrowed before opening onto a small, neglected courtyard tucked behind the palace kitchens. The air shifted immediately, touched by the breath of the sea. Ivy climbed the stone walls, twisting in thick ropes over the crumbling edges of a fountain that had long since run dry. The scent of jasmine hung in the air, stirred by the salt breeze that drifted through the cracks in the high garden walls. Isabel paused in the archway, but Amir continued to the center of the courtyard, his footsteps soft over the uneven stones. He stopped beneath the overgrown trellis and turned toward her, the low light catching the line of his jaw and the quiet seriousness in his expression. "It's difficult," he said, in careful Spanish, "to explain how loud silence can become when no one speaks your name in a voice that feels true." His accent was rich, precise, not polished like a noble's, but deliberate in its restraint. Isabel took a slow step forward, setting the folded linens on the stone ledge of the dry fountain, her fingers brushing a sprig of ivy. Amir's gaze softened as he watched her. "I didn't expect anything today," I have stopped expecting anything from rooms filled with men who see only the robes I wear. He took a breath. But then you spoke. In my own tongue. Isabel's hands curled at her sides. She didn't trust her voice. The weight of what she'd done still rested heavily in her chest, but it was slowly being reshaped into something less sharp. Something like understanding. You didn't only give me tea, he said gently. You gave me dignity. She looked at him then, meeting his eyes. It wasn't planned, she said, her voice low. I know. He smiled faintly. That's why it meant something. The air between them shifted. It wasn't the kind of closeness that could be measured by distance. It moved more subtly, through breath, through silence, through the brief flicker of expression in a half-lit garden when the world was looking the other way. He moved to the side of the fountain, resting one hand against the rim of the stone. The vines there had begun to blossom, tiny white flowers opening to the cool of night. Your mother, he said, now in Arabic, the language flowing easily from his lips. She taught you. Isabel nodded. She lived in Tangier until she was 17. Her family came back to Spain after the French blockade. She missed the sound of the prayer bells. He listened carefully, the lines of his face still and attentive. She taught me words for warmth, Isabel said. For kindness. She said there are words in Arabic that don't exist in Castilian. Not really. That's why she never stopped using them. Amir's eyes held hers. There are. Their voices lowered further, not by intention, but instinct. In the hush of the courtyard, even their breath seemed louder. He asked about her time in Morocco, how old she had been, whether she remembered the food, the festivals, the sea air. She told him what she could. Flashes of memory, colors, the call to prayer that had startled her awake in the early mornings and then soothed her back to sleep. They spoke of things not found in books, of small, ordinary details that revealed more than titles or treaties ever could. He told her that his favorite place in Muscat was a small garden between the harbor walls, where the breeze carried the scent of the sea and the earth at once. She told him that her mother used to sing when she cooked, always in Arabic, but only when she thought no one was listening. With each exchanged word, the space between them thinned. She no longer felt her own edges so distinctly. The fear had not left, but it had become quiet, replaced by something deeper, slower. A sound broke the stillness. A door creaked, somewhere nearby, heavy wood against stone. They both froze. From the upper gallery, a voice called out, male, sharp, authoritative. Amir stepped back at once, his face tightening. He looked toward the passage they'd come from, then back to her, his expression urgent, but not panicked. I must return, he said. They'll come looking. Isabel nodded, her heart suddenly loud again in her chest. He reached into the inner pocket of his robe and drew out something small, his fingers closing around it briefly before extending his hand toward hers. She opened her palm without hesitation. Into it, he placed a tiny carved bead, mother of pearl, smoothed by time, the surface warm from the press of his skin. I want to see you again, he said, not as a question, but as a truth laid bare between them. She curled her fingers around the bead, her chest tight, every part of her drawn taut with the weight of the moment. He stepped into the shadowed archway, pausing only once more to look at her, something unspoken flickering in his eyes. And then he vanished into the corridor. Isabel stood still, the cool night air threading through the ivy and across her skin. She tucked the bead carefully into the pocket of her apron, her fingers lingering a moment on its shape. Then she turned and saw the head steward standing at the edge of the courtyard, watching her with folded arms. The head steward said nothing at first. He stood at the edge of the courtyard as though carved from the same stone that lined its crumbling walls, arms folded, his gaze heavy with judgment. Isabel straightened instinctively, though the carved bead in her apron felt like a glowing coal against her skin. There was no need to speak. His silence was a verdict. He gave her a slight nod, one that did not invite questions, and turned. She followed. The walk back through the servants' passageways felt longer this time, more exposed. She kept her hands folded before her, head bowed just enough to avoid drawing attention from anyone who might pass. They didn't go toward the kitchens or the maid's wing, but veered instead toward the southern edge of the palace grounds, a quieter corridor seldom used except by those whose tasks fell outside the daily rhythms of polite court life. The office door stood slightly ajar. The steward pushed it open and gestured for her to step inside. The room was small, windowless, with walls of pale stone and a single wooden desk. A narrow chair sat across from it, empty. No fire had been lit, and the chill in the air bit through the fabric of Isabel's sleeves. The door closed behind her with a quiet finality, and the steward crossed to stand on the other side of the desk. He didn't sit. "You have been noticed," he said, without any preamble. "And not for the reasons one hopes to be in a house like this." She kept her eyes fixed on the grain of the floorboards. Her jaw tightened, but she did not speak. "Rumors travel faster than footsteps in these halls," he continued, "and some whispers are no longer just whispers. Count Sebastian is aware of what happened in the courtyard. Others are too." Still, she stayed silent. "You are not being dismissed," he said. "That would draw attention. But your current placement is no longer appropriate. From this evening forward, you'll be reassigned to the laundry wing by the stables." It was not a punishment in name, but it was a removal. The stables were far from the palace proper, outside the main building's reach. She would no longer be near the guest wings or the audience chambers. She would not serve at meals. She would not carry linens past the nobles' doors. She would disappear. The steward's tone didn't waver, though his gaze narrowed. "Do you understand?" "Yes," she said quietly. He nodded once, brisk and final. "Pack your things. You'll be escorted shortly." She was taken not back to her chamber, but to the scullery where her apron and satchel had been placed on the bench by the hearth. One of the junior maids stood in the corner, wringing her hands and pretending not to look. Another passed behind her without saying a word. No one met her eyes. She opened the satchel with steady fingers. The carved bead was still in her apron pocket. She slipped her hand beneath the folded cloth and tucked the bead into a hidden seam near the lining, alongside the note from the prince and the fragile sprig of dried thyme. Her mother's locket, still warm from where it had rested against her skin all day, was clasped around her neck, hidden beneath her bodice. She did not take it off. The walk to the stables was short, but to Isabel it felt as though she'd crossed some invisible border. The stone changed beneath her feet, from marble to worn flagstone, then to rough dirt. The low-ceilinged building that housed the laundry wing was tucked beside the horse paddock, its windows small and fogged with steam. Inside, the air was damp and thick with the scents of boiled linen, lye soap, and straw. She was given no tour, no greeting. A bucket was placed in her hands, and she was told to begin. All afternoon and well into the evening, she worked in the half-light of the washroom, sleeves rolled to her elbows, wrists raw from scrubbing. The rhythm of labor numbed her thoughts. Water sloshed, soap foamed. Her hands moved without instruction, dipping fabric into vats, lifting steaming sheets from copper kettles, rinsing, wringing, hauling. Outside, the sky darkened. The muted clamor of the main palace fell away, distant and muffled through layers of stone and space. But shortly after nightfall, a bell rang out from the palace tower. 2 slow tolls. A summons. She recognized the tone. Diplomatic guests were being called to a second private audience. Her breath stilled. This time, the terms would be harder. There would be offers beneath offers, questions that carried no answers, and pressure. Always pressure. She could feel it as though she stood in that chamber again, beneath 100 veiled glances and eyes that searched for weakness behind every courteous phrase. She thought of him sitting there, as he had before, hands resting still, face unreadable. How many times had he been pulled between duty and desire? How many times had he allowed himself to feel nothing just to survive? She leaned against the doorframe, the hem of her skirt damp from the washwater, and let the sound of the sea reach her through the broken slats in the stable walls. That night, she was shown to a cot in a narrow alcove at the end of the laundry corridor. It was barely long enough for her to stretch her legs, and the mattress sagged in the middle, but she was too tired to care. She removed her apron carefully, her fingers brushing over the hidden seam, checking that the bead was still there. It was. She curled onto her side and pressed her hand to her chest, palm over the fabric, feeling its shape against her ribs like a talisman. The wind shifted outside. A shutter creaked somewhere down the corridor. Then footsteps. Soft, deliberate. They paused outside her door. She sat up slowly, the blankets sliding from her shoulders, a whisper of paper. She pushed off the thin covers and stepped to the door, heart in her throat. Kneeling, she reached beneath the edge and drew out a folded note. The seal was unfamiliar to most, but not to her. She had seen it carved into the gold pin at his collar. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the parchment. Inside was a time and a place for one final meeting. The air was still when Isabel slipped out of the laundry wing, her footsteps silent on the gravel path that cut behind the outer kitchens. The moon had not risen yet, and the palace grounds were bathed in the soft, tentative dark before true night. A faint mist clung low to the earth, curling around her ankles like fingers, blurring the edges of stones and hedges, softening the world into quiet uncertainty. She moved with the practiced caution of someone who had spent most of her life learning how not to be seen. The path to the inner courtyard had always been familiar, lined with oleanders, guarded by silence. But tonight, she saw the torchlight before she reached it. Guards. 2 of them, standing at opposite corners of the space where jasmine vines had once offered refuge. Their halberds glinted faintly in the lamplight, and the low murmur of their conversation drifted on the wind. She halted before stepping into view, her breath caught. The note she carried, the one that had been slipped under her door hours earlier, rested inside the fold of her apron. The parchment's crease was still sharp. She had memorized the instructions. Not the courtyard, the chapel. She turned and took the longer way around the stables, ducking beneath the arch that framed the eastern corridor, a narrow hall flanked by old storage rooms and boarded windows. The smell of dry plaster and cold earth filled the air, the scent of places long left untouched. The stones beneath her feet had warped slightly with time, and the passage dipped with each step. The corridor ended at a low wooden door, half sunken, almost hidden behind a crumbling trellis. It groaned when she pushed it open, but the sound was swallowed quickly by the dense hush that lived beyond it. The chapel was darker than she remembered. The walls still bore the soot of the fire that had ravaged the altar decades ago, black streaks climbing like vines toward the vaulted ceiling. A faint scent of burnt timber lingered, layered beneath dust and old incense. Candles had been lit, 3 of them, set carefully along the steps that once led to the altar. Their flames flickered in the draught, casting shadows that danced across broken stone and scorched wood. He stood just beyond them. Prince Amir, cloaked in shadow, yet unmistakable. His robe tonight was a deep blue, lined in black, the sleeves fitted close to his wrists. The faint glint of embroidery caught the candlelight, and beneath the hem his slippers moved soundlessly across the stone. His turban was absent. His hair, loose and dark, curled slightly at the edges, brushing his jaw. When he looked up, his face was grave, but his eyes, even in the dim, still held the quiet warmth she remembered. He didn't speak at first. He waited as she stepped inside, waited as the door closed behind her, and the outside world fell away like a dream. She approached slowly, the hem of her apron brushing her ankles, her hands cold despite the heavy air. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low. "I said I would," she replied. He nodded, but there was a weight in the air between them, heavier than before. Something unsaid, waiting. "I need you to know the truth," he said at last, his tone careful. "You deserve that." She remained still, listening. He glanced toward the ruined altar, then back at her. "My purpose here is not only diplomatic, it's ceremonial. My father, the Sultan, sent me with his full authority to negotiate, not only trade, an alliance, a permanent tie." Her heart sank, even before he spoke the next words. "The expectation is that I accept a match. A noblewoman, likely someone chosen to secure favor with the Spanish crown." "Elena," Isabel said quietly. "Yes." The name hung in the air like smoke. He stepped closer, not enough to touch her, but enough that she could feel the press of his presence again. "If I refuse, it will be seen as an insult, not just to this court, but to my own. My father has placed his trust in me to choose wisely." Her breath trembled. "And if you don't, there will be consequences," he said simply. "For me, for the delegation, perhaps even for future relations between our nations." Silence settled again, this time heavier. She looked down, the candlelight catching the curve of her cheek. "But I cannot agree to it," he said, and the quiet in his voice held something almost fierce beneath it. "Not because I resent the woman, or the duty, but because something changed. The moment you spoke to me, in Arabic, without fear, without design, you saw me, not the prince, not the diplomat, just me." Her eyes lifted to his. "That has not happened in years," he said. "Perhaps not ever." He reached into the folds of his robe, drawing out another slip of parchment, this one smaller than the last, already creased. "I leave in 2 days, but tomorrow morning, my attendants will bring me to the eastern dock at dawn. A small vessel will carry me to the trade ship anchored in the bay. From there, we return home." He extended the parchment to her. "If you come," he said, "I will take you with me. There will be questions, objections, but I will answer them. I will protect you." Her hand closed around the paper, its edge sharp against her skin. "This isn't a request made lightly," he continued. "It's a risk, for both of us. But I won't lie to you. I would rather live in defiance of duty than build a future on a lie." She looked down at the folded note in her palm. Her thoughts raced, through all the warnings, all the rules, all the years she had spent being careful, being quiet, being unseen. Her life had been measured in caution, and yet this moment was unlike any she had known. To be chosen, not for service, not for obligation, but because someone had seen her and did not turn away. She looked up. "I'll come," she said. He didn't reach for her, didn't press the decision with touch or plea, but his breath seemed to release then, a quiet exhale of something held tightly for too long. She moved to leave, knowing any hesitation would raise suspicion if she were seen. The parchment tucked into her apron beside the hidden bead, her pulse loud in her ears. She turned, stepping through the quiet chapel, each footfall louder now in the silence. The door opened without sound, and she stepped into the darkness beyond. She didn't see the figure crouched behind the ruined altar, cloaked in shadow, eyes watching. The same page who reported directly to Count Sebastian. The sea mist lay thick over the harbor, softening the outlines of ships and crates into blurred silhouettes. Dawn stretched slowly across the docks, casting a dull silver sheen over the water, the kind that dulled color and magnified sound. Wooden planks creaked beneath the shuffle of boots and barefooted fishermen, while the clatter of hooks and the rustle of nets formed a rhythm older than the city itself. Gull cries echoed across the sky, and the sharp tang of salt air clung to everything. Isabel moved like someone born of fog and silence. Cloaked in a plain shawl of dull brown wool, her dress a faded shade of gray, she passed through the bustle unnoticed. Her hair was pinned tightly beneath a scarf, her face lowered in a posture so practiced it felt like breathing. She clutched the edges of the shawl to her chest, concealing a small cloth bundle. Her satchel, light with necessity. A change of garments, the carved bead, the folded note. The time marked on the parchment had nearly arrived. She stood beside a stone column near the mooring post, half shielded by the rising steam from a nearby fish cart. Her breath came quick, visible in the morning chill, her fingers tightening on the folds of fabric with each passing second. She scanned the path from the south, the one Amir said he would take. Every creak of wheels, every bark from a merchant twisted her nerves tighter. She had never been this close to freedom, nor this afraid of it. Then came the sound of hooves. Not many, just one. She turned, breath halting. A single rider approached from the southern path, the horse moving at a steady, deliberate pace. Behind him, 2 men on foot, dressed not in robes, but in tailored Spanish coats trimmed in the colors of the court. It was not Amir. Count Sebastián de los Ríos dismounted with the ease of someone long accustomed to command. His boots struck the dock planks with the finality of law. His coat was perfectly tailored, dark wool lined with crimson, and a fine leather glove covered the hand that rested on the hilt of his riding crop. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. 2 guards flanked him, palace men, not soldiers, but with the same air of authority. Isabel didn't move. He approached with calm, measured steps, his expression unreadable save for the faint flicker of something that gleamed like satisfaction behind his eyes. "Señorita de Montijo," he said, his voice as quiet as it was unyielding. "I believe you are waiting for someone." She kept her hands close to her body, her shoulders drawn, but did not look away. "The prince has been delayed," he continued. "A private audience with the governor, urgent, unavoidable." She said nothing. Count Sebastian tilted his head slightly. "You did not think we would allow him to vanish without ceremony, did you?" One of the guards stepped forward. Isabel's grip tightened around the shawl. "You will return to the household," the count said, quietly, without resistance. "Any further contact with the foreign delegation will be considered sabotage." The word struck like a blade dulled by repetition, but still sharp enough to cut. "You've embarrassed yourself enough," he added, his voice cooling further. "And your presence here confirms everything I had begun to suspect." He held out a hand. She hesitated, then passed the cloth bundle to him. He opened it with care, unfolding the satchel's flap, the damp air curling the edges of the parchment tucked within. He searched briefly, methodically, until his fingers closed around something small. He drew it out and held it to the light. The carved bead, mother of pearl, smooth and glinting faintly in the silver haze of morning. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, as though seeing her fully for the first time, and registering her not as a girl, but as a threat. Then he turned. "Escort her back," he told the guards. "Make certain she is seen." The guards stepped forward. Isabel followed without struggle. Across the harbor, where the masts of merchant ships rose like skeletal trees against the pale sky, the trade vessel waited. But its boat, its path to escape, remained at the far pier, empty. Amir paced inside the governor's council chamber, his patience thinning with each passing minute. The meeting, framed as a final gesture of gratitude and mutual respect, had stretched without direction. Questions meandered. Topics shifted. It was only as the governor's tone grew vaguer and the conversation looped that Amir saw the design in it. He had been detained. The realization bloomed cold beneath his skin. When the meeting finally ended, he descended the palace stairs with deliberate calm, his steps precise, his face a mask carved of stone. He reached the docks before the sun fully cleared the horizon. She was not there. He scanned the figures moving along the mooring posts. Fishmongers, sailors, dockhands, no shawl of faded brown, no steady green eyes. Then, from the side, a voice called out, casual, unknowing. "She was here earlier," said a boy of no more than 12, perched on a crate. "Girl in gray, stood near the post. They came for her. Took her back to the big house." Amir's chest constricted. He said nothing, only nodded once and turned. The carved bead, he realized, was gone from his inner pocket. His composure did not crack, not in front of the dockhands, not on the walk back to the guest wing. But fury simmered beneath the stillness, not the anger of insult, not even betrayal. It was the fury of obstruction, of being maneuvered like a pawn in a game where the rules shifted without honor. He returned to his chambers, changed into formal court attire, and sent word that he would attend the evening's diplomatic dinner as expected. That night, the palace ballroom was a lantern of sound and color. Chandeliers blazed overhead, throwing golden light across the polished floors. Violins played from the raised gallery, their music weaving through the clinking of glasses and the lilting laughter of nobles dressed in silks and brocade. Amir entered alone. His robes were darker than usual, lined in silver, his bearing severe. He greeted the hosts with measured civility, his gaze impassive. Doña Elena stood near the center of the room, radiant in a pale gown of embroidered satin, her hair adorned with pearls. She turned to him with the practiced smile of a woman who had waited for this moment. But he barely acknowledged her. His eyes had already moved, searching, scanning the edges of the room. And then he saw her. Near the far wall, nearly hidden behind the crowd, Isabel moved with a tray in her hands. Her dress was plain and clean, the white apron tied carefully at the back. Her shoulders were straight, but her face was pale, her fingers stiff around the silver handles of the tray. She had not expected to be here. She had not expected to see him, but she did. Their eyes met. And across the ballroom, Doña Elena, standing at her uncle's side, turned just in time to witness it. The days that followed unfurled like silk drawn slowly across a blade, smooth on the surface, but perilously sharp beneath. From the outside, little had changed. Isabel returned to her duties in silence, rising before the sun, washing linens, and moving through the great halls with a quiet grace that drew no praise and invited no questions. Yet every task, every footstep, was carried out under the watchful eye of the steward. He made no accusations, offered no words, but his presence lingered around corners, in doorways, and behind closed doors. Even the younger maids stepped cautiously around her now, their smiles hesitant, their voices lowered. Doña Elena never spoke to her again, but her presence was just as exacting. When they passed one another in the ballroom, or in the shadowed corridors leading to the service galleries, Isabel felt the brush of her gaze, cool, considering, unreadable. It wasn't hostility that moved behind Elena's eyes. It was calculation. Isabel had become a variable in a game that was never meant to have surprises. At court, Prince Amir moved through each obligation with practiced serenity. He attended the dinners, offered polite responses in flawless Castilian, and endured the speeches and shallow inquiries that accompanied each formal exchange. To those who watched him, he appeared calm, diplomatic, even gracious. But beneath the ceremonial silks and carefully composed expressions, something quieter burned. Not defiance, not rage, but resolve. Measured, deliberate, and no longer willing to yield. One morning, just before dawn, he summoned the elder advisor who had served his family since before he was born. The man arrived in the private antechamber with slow steps and the scent of clove oil in the folds of his robe. His face was lined by years spent in negotiation, his silence full of the weight of listening. Amir spoke plainly, without ceremony. He told him the truth, that the alliance, though politically advantageous, had become unbearable. That the courtship expected of him was not merely a duty, it was a denial of something real, of someone real. He confessed that there had been a moment, brief but unmistakable, when he had glimpsed the life he wanted, not the one shaped for him. The advisor said nothing for a long time. He simply sat, hands folded, eyes steady, as Amir outlined the alternative. A trade compact without the matrimonial bond, an agreement grounded in mutual interest and respect, not pretense. It would save the alliance, preserve peace, and allow him to return with dignity intact. But it would also demand a narrative, one that left the Spanish court with its pride and his own family with no reason to question his motives. Only when Emir had finished did the advisor speak, and with that rare, quiet nod, he granted his blessing. By midday, the plan was set in motion. An official letter was delivered to the Spanish Chamberlain requesting the prince's early return home, citing the aggravation of a long-standing illness, a condition worsened by travel and the strain of diplomacy. It was a subtle fiction, one too polite to be contested openly. The Spanish officials expressed their regrets, though the hint of relief flickered in their responses. A smooth conclusion served everyone best. Preparations began for his departure. 48 hours. Enough time to stage a graceful exit, to finalize terms of the trade agreement, and to disappear without scandal. But there was one task left. That evening, Emir sat at the writing desk in his chamber and took up a fresh sheet of parchment. He dipped the quill in ink and addressed the letter not to Isabel, as he longed to, but to the man who had orchestrated the game, Count Sebastián de los Ríos. He wrote slowly, deliberately, no flourish, no venom. He did not threaten. He did not plead. Instead, he described what had become evident, how civility, when weaponized, could wound more deeply than cruelty. He wrote of women used as leverage, and servants treated as shadows until they dared speak. He wrote of decorum bent into a leash, and loyalty used as armor for cowardice. He did not mention Isabel's name. He did not need to. At the end, he wrote, "No alliance built on coercion will endure, and no peace is worth keeping if it demands the erasure of another soul." He sealed the letter with the emblem of the Sultanate, stamped in wax and carried by one of his attendants directly into the Count's study. That night, the palace glowed with torches set along the garden paths. Most of the guests had retired to their quarters, the courtiers weary from another evening of politeness masquerading as diplomacy. The fountain still ran, and the sea air crept in through the cypress trees. Emir walked alone near the reflecting pool behind the southern wing, the sound of his steps muffled by the manicured grass and the low rustle of water. The moon was high, broken only by the sharp silhouette of the palace towers against the sky. The pool shimmered beneath it, still and black as obsidian. Then he saw her. Isabel stepped from the shadows of the hedge path, her cloak drawn tight around her shoulders. Her hair was loose tonight, falling in soft waves down her back, and her face was pale in the moonlight but calm. He said nothing. Neither did she. There was no need. She reached his side, her hand slipping into his without hesitation, and for a long moment they stood that way. Two figures in silence, in the only kind of truth left to them. Then she leaned her head gently against his shoulder, and he rested his hand over hers. The sky over Cadiz blushed faintly with the first stroke of sunrise, the pale edge of the sun cresting over the Atlantic like the hem of a golden cloak. The bay shimmered with the soft movement of the tide, its surface turning from pewter to rose with each passing moment. In the harbor, anchored just beyond the reach of the outer piers, the Sultanate's ship stood ready, its sails trimmed in gold and white, catching the morning light with the slow, proud lift of ceremony. On the marble promenade that stretched the length of the harbor's edge, the Spanish court had gathered in their finest. The scene was quiet, almost reverent, the hum of polite conversation muffled beneath the weight of formality. Cloaks rustled in the breeze, gloves were adjusted, faces maintained composure. The final audience, they called it. A farewell meant to honor the prince's departure and to affirm goodwill between nations. Count Sebastián de los Ríos stood apart from the others, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. His expression was unreadable, tight-lipped, but his posture betrayed no loss. Whatever unraveled behind closed doors had not pierced his public mask. The absence of a formal engagement had been explained away with careful diplomacy. The alliance, they said, would continue in trade. That was enough, for now. Beside him stood Doña Elena, still and polished in a dove-gray traveling coat embroidered at the cuffs. Her beauty, always precise, was untouched by fatigue, but her gaze remained distant, fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. When Prince Amir approached, she offered a composed smile, cool, indifferent, the gesture of a woman who had accepted the shape of disappointment without letting it crease her pride. There were no questions. No one asked about the missing betrothal. No one dared. The departure had been framed with elegance, a necessary withdrawal due to health, a gracious delay of formalities, a postponement rather than a refusal. And so, with all the right words in place, the court watched with polite detachment. Prince Amir moved with quiet purpose, his robe of deep indigo catching the early light as he stepped onto the promenade. His attendants followed behind in formal procession, robes crisp, heads bowed, their movements solemn and restrained. At first glance, all seemed as it should be. But then, at his side, beneath the sweeping fold of a deep blue traveling cloak, walked a woman. She moved without drawing attention to herself, her head lowered, the hood of her cloak concealing most of her face. Her hands were tucked into the folds of the garment, her pace measured to match the prince's, neither hurried nor hesitant. To most, she was just another figure among many, unnoticed in the shuffle of morning departure. But to those who looked more closely, something shifted. She was not one of the delegation. She was not a noblewoman of the court. And yet she did not trail behind the others, nor was she ushered to the side. She walked beside him, not as a servant, not as an afterthought, at equal stride. Isabel felt every step down to the marrow of her bones, the cloak draped heavily across her shoulders, concealing the simple dress she wore beneath, her boots damp with morning dew. Her fingers tightened around the satchel she carried, the contents light but meaningful. The carved bead remained tucked into the small linen pouch inside, a silent weight over her heart. She did not lift her gaze. She didn't need to. Each step was a defiance spoken without a word. As they reached the end of the promenade, where the stone path met the boarding ramp that led to the waiting vessel, Amir paused. His gaze passed over the gathering, over nobles and officials, over those who had tried to corner him with duty and expectation. He bowed once, slight and formal, his silence more dignified than any speech. There were no cheers, no send-off of pomp and grandeur, just the quiet acknowledgement of a guest departing under honorable pretense. And still, no one asked. No one pointed to the figure beside him. No one dared interrupt what none of them fully understood. The boarding ramp creaked underfoot as they crossed it, and the soft sway of the vessel met Isabel with a subtle shift beneath her boots. A sailor stood at the ready, bowing his head as the prince passed. Isabel followed, her heart thudding not with fear, but with the unfamiliar weight of decision. There was no going back. Whatever waited beyond the horizon was unknown, unshaped, but it would be hers. Theirs. The ship pulled from the dock with a slow, steady groan, the sails unfurling overhead with a whisper like breath. The oars dipped into the water, setting the vessel free from the harbor's embrace, and Cadiz began to fade behind them, its white stone glinting in the dawn like distant memory. Isabel stood beside Amir at the rail, the wind tugging strands of her hair loose from beneath her hood. For the first time in years, she let it. Let the wind touch her face. Let the sky widen around her. Let the silence stretch, not as something that isolated, but something that held space for what had not yet been spoken. His hand found hers. She didn't look down. Their fingers wove together naturally, quietly, and they stood that way. Still, steady, as the coast disappeared behind them and the sea opened wide and unknowable ahead. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. What did you think of Isabel and Amir's story? Was there a moment that touched your heart the most? Maybe the scene at the dock, or the final goodbye to Cadiz? I'd love to know what stood out to you. Please leave a comment and share your favorite part of the story. I truly enjoy reading each one. Your thoughts mean so much and help bring these stories to life even more. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.